Okay, we're on the hour now. So hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar entitled Successful Steps for Data Retention and Minimization under the GDPR. Before we jump in, there's a few quick housekeeping notes I need to cover with you guys. You'll see a chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel that allows you to submit questions to us at any time. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar where we'll try to respond to any questions asked on the content or answer as we go through where possible. The recording of this session and the accompanying slides will be posted on the Extero website in the coming days. I'll share a link to the resources via email once that's published. And this is a Data Protection Network webinar. Founded in 2014, the Data Protection Network is an independent network of like-minded professionals with experience in data protection and marketing. Its role is to provide accessible guidance and thought leadership on emerging issues around the use of personal data. This webinar has been sponsored by Extero, the industry's only unified legal GRC software platform that enables you to address your privacy, compliance, and litigation risks more effectively and at lower costs. My name is Stuart Davidson. I'm the European Marketing Director at Extero, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session today. I'm also really looking forward to hearing the opinions and insights from our panel, but I just want to stress that they're just that, only their opinions, and don't necessarily reflect the thoughts and positions of their organizations. So Simon, welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself first, please, and sharing a few words about your experience and expertise?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you on this lovely, warm, sunny day. So my name's I'm Simon Blanchard. I'm at Data Protection Network and the consultancy arm of that, Data Protection Network Associates. So DPN, I think as Stuart said, exists to provide kind of thought leadership, insight, and generally opinions and information to people that are interested in privacy. So we've got that's DPN really. From my point of view, I've been with DPN for 5 years now and work with a very large range of clients. We work with quite a few blue chips. We work with SMEs, also companies in the charity sector. And obviously, as part of that, worked on all sorts of different things, and data retention comes up time and time again. And I'm sure Stuart's going to probably mention the guidance that we just produced shortly, so I'll save that for you, Stuart.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Simon. And just on that note, before I do forget, the DPN has published some data retention guidance on their website. A link will be sent to it in the follow-up email, but do please go over to the DPN website and download that. It's really good, really great guidance. And this webinar is based on that guidance. We're going to follow up with some commentary and extend the thoughts on that. So many thanks, Simon. Great to have you on. Tilly, welcome. Would you mind sharing a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tilly Lang, and I am a qualified solicitor in England, Wales, and also Ireland. I started off my career in sort of corporate governance, and that sort of was a good segue to data protection as that started picking up with pieces of legislation coming out, and of course GDPR. I've worked with a number of multinational organizations in regards to their privacy program. In the first instance, obviously focusing on getting ready for GDPR to come in place. But as we all know, the data protection landscape globally is increasing, and there's a number of legislation posed to come in this year. So helping them get ready for new pieces of legislation, but also make sure that they are keeping their current data protection program up and running and in accordance to what the legislation is. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tilly. Thanks for sharing your time with us today. Tanya, welcome again. Would you mind rounding off the introductions and sharing a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Tanya Joyce. I'm a data solutions manager for British Gas Business, which sounds a bit weird, obviously, but what that really means is I actually lead a small satellite privacy team and the governance team for the business-to-business part of British Gas. So I've got quite a fair bit of experience in the on-the-ground handling of day-to-day data protection activities.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Excellent. And great to have you all on board. Thanks again for sharing your time with us today. Looking forward to this one. So data retention, are we keeping data longer than necessary? And it's interesting to just think about what necessary means here, because a large percentage of data in organizations is classified as ROTs, the redundant, obsolete, or trivial data that has no business value. And in fact, a common statistic I frequently see is that 70% of a company's data is ROTs. But also the data you don't have can't expose you to any risk. And this is where a lot of attention has grown recently since the introduction of the GDPR in particular. Data you don't have can't be breached. It isn't discoverable in litigation or investigations of disputes, and it doesn't take up any company resources to manage it or even secure it. So why would you keep it longer than necessary? Quite simply, I would argue it's either down to organizations not knowing what data they have in the first place, or not having the right people, processes, and technologies in place to adequately address their data retention obligations. So let's talk about risk, and we need to be mindful that data retention is ingrained in regulations like the GDPR. So of course there are risks to not adequately addressing it, and significant risks in fact. Simon, perhaps you could start us off here by commenting on some of these risks of over or under retention.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a number of risks, obviously, from either keeping the data too long, or of course for not keeping it long enough. The more common problem is, I think, for organisations that are hanging on to data for a lot longer than they really should be. I think that the one you've probably highlighted very much on the previous slide, Stuart, is the information security risk. You know, if you're holding data for too long, of course, there's the risk that could be breached. You know, or we could have some unauthorized access to that data, or it could be shared with the wrong organizations, or somebody sees it who shouldn't have it. That's I guess a fairly obvious risk to organizations. But equally, and I think we'll illustrate this probably on the next slide, there are clearly legal risks as well from keeping data too long. We're now starting to see some legal cases in this area, which we'll come on to in a moment. But equally, there's a risk that you might need to keep data for longer. You know, you might want it under legal hold if you know, if it's data that's the subject of legal proceedings. You'll need to be hanging on to data maybe for perhaps longer than you planned. So, I mean, there's a range of other ones. Obviously, you know, it can damage your reputation if you're holding data for too long, or you can have contractual commitments, things like that. So, I'll leave it there and let others have a word.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Tilly, keen to hear your thoughts and comments on the risks of over or in fact under retaining data.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, look, I mean, I think this is a problem that most, if not every organization sort of experiences regarding sort of retention of data. A lot of the times, sort of as mentioned, it's legacy data, and obviously with the GDPR coming into place, obviously it was ongoing concern beforehand, but obviously with the GDPR and the associated fines, it really led to a number of organizations sort of really steadying up and actively taking a look at sort of what data they hold, what systems they have in place, and sort of how the data life cycle, basically, regarding sort of how the data flows through the systems, and also sort of what data was being kept in the organization and for what purposes. And I think sort of prior to the GDPR coming into place, there was a lot of angst regarding the actual amount of data that organizations sort of had in place, and also this sort of panic almost regarding sort of how organizations were going to sort of put policies in place and actively sort of do the housekeeping needed sort of to put processes in place. And look, and I think one thing that is acknowledged is it is a work in progress. Obviously, sort of, you know, a data retention sort of policy is needed, but also organizations need to make sure and do audits to make sure that they are going through the process of deleting data in accordance with that policy. And also, prior to that, and to be able to do that, there's a number of sort of understanding what data the organization has, classifying it, reviewing it, and then also obviously going through the final aspect sort of deleting that data. And it's not just sort of for the data privacy professionals in the organization to work on, but it's a collaborative sort of approach to data retention and sort of well, over retention, but also sort of under retention, to make sure sort of that all key stakeholders sort of are involved and that the processes are in place to be able to have the organization move forward with the data that they require and are currently sort of using, but also when that data becomes obsolete or no longer needed, that systems or processes are kicked into place that the data can be reviewed and then deleted when and if legally necessary to do so.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great overview. Tanya, any comments you'd like to add here around risks organizations face due to data retention?
I've got nothing really to add in terms of the risks, but I have got an interesting sort of anecdote that relates to this. One thing that we've seen quite a lot of, especially recently, is an expectation almost from individuals requesting access to their information that we will over retain it as a business, which is quite odd. Because say, for example, somebody asks for copies of call recordings. If we've got a retention policy in place that says we can only hold those for, as an example, maybe 4 months, and they're looking for calls that were recorded a couple of years ago, they will be completely incensed by the idea that we don't have them anymore, in spite of the fact that what we've really done there is done something to sort of protect their information by not keeping it for any longer than we really need it. So it can be a really odd little balance between doing what's right so that you don't risk breaching the information or losing it somewhere, and doing what your customers expect you to do. And it can, on occasion as well, result in complaints going to the ICO because the customer will insist that we haven't provided them with the information that they're entitled to, when we literally don't have it anymore. It's a very odd little balancing act.
Yeah, that's interesting, and many thanks for sharing that anecdote. Yeah, interesting concept there. So I wanted to just really quickly highlight the real life impact here of risk of data retention. And there's 3 notable fines that are issued by different supervisory authorities across Europe for inadequate data retention practices. The third one I'd just like to really quickly touch on and highlight. A fine was issued by the ICO to the tune of £275,000 to a London-based pharmacy for careless storage of patient data and for failing to state retention periods for personal data. Particularly interesting to see they had 500,000 unsecured paper documents, and I wonder how common this might be across especially medium or larger organizations, especially those who traditionally are more paper-intensive businesses. So data retention is mandated in data protection law, and it is being enforced by supervisory authorities. So now is definitely the time to make sure your practices are compliant and defensible. So let's start to discuss 4 main steps here you can take to minimizing your data. The first is establishing a robust data inventory to catalog all your data, your sources and activities. Then you need to decide on your retention periods before communicating and taking actions on your retention schedules. And then the final step is an important one, but it's the ongoing review of your data retention practices. So let's jump in and explore the first step, which is the data inventory. And I love this slide because it demonstrates how granular and the level of detail you need to go into in order to establish a comprehensive and robust data inventory. Simon, I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences with establishing a data inventory and also its importance for data retention.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Stuart. Yeah. So I think the key thing is that organisations obviously do need to fully understand, what kind of personal data that they're processing, and really also understand the different purposes that they're processing it for. But to be able, and I appreciate that organisations may be at very different, positions in this. Some organisations will be very mature in understanding all of the data that they hold and whereabouts they store it, what they're using it for, the lawful basis, all of those things that you require under Article 30 of GDPR. But some organisations might be, still less mature maybe in their approach and need to develop along that. So I guess the first question is, so where do we store data? Let's start with that bit first. And I think the first thing is really that you may be storing data in a lot more places than maybe you realise. There's obviously the company's IT systems, but also think about the backups that you keep of those. All the SaaS related applications, more and more we see businesses holding personal data on SaaS applications. But in addition, kind of all of the shadow IT, as we call it, or grey IT, and all of the things like the Excel spreadsheets and all of the other little programs that have built up over time, which many different kind of functions or departments might hold that could, quite often these are holding personal data that maybe people have not really got top of mind, and certainly the IT team quite often unaware of those. So they're quite tricky often to get a handle on exactly what you've got and how long it's been held. But also thinking about things like archives, might be holding paper records off-site, or maybe perhaps you've got some decommissioned systems that they decommissioned the system but never actually took the personal data off. So I think the first thing is just recognising that there's a very broad landscape for many organisations about where that data is stored, and then thinking about so how can we actually identify what we're processing and how we're using it. So, you could think about using, how do we go about doing this? I mean, you could use your kind of existing kind of information sources, like your IT systems for a start, as I said, and your kind of information security team, any data mapping that's been done, looking at the kind of contracts that you have that identify third parties that are processing your data and so on. So by going through all of that side. The next part you could do, of course, is look at data discovery software to kind of mine through your systems, and there's obviously some many pros and some cons against that as well. Being able to identify the data that's that's held across your systems in an automated technology way. But another approach that's very common is to interview kind of the key stakeholders, so that you can understand more about their processing. Obviously, it's a great opportunity to do kind of workshops, things like that, to help them to understand why you need to understand this data and the level of information that you need to know. And you might wish to use some kind of automation tools as well to help you do that, to help you capture the information that you gather from those sessions. So yeah, there's a number of different ways that you can do it, I think, but it's really just pointing out that it's quite a broad task, and I think it's one that many organisations, both large and small, have wrestled with in a number of different forms. And I think quite a few, certainly of our clients and other businesses that I've talked to, it's something that we very much see as an ongoing journey. That it's something that's probably won't be complete as such. You'll continue to evolve, continue to develop it, and looking to keep on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't a new concept, right? It seems like everyone has a data inventory or a data map, or at the very least, a ROPA record of processing activities. You'd hope so anyway, with GDPR compliance. So this definitely isn't a new concept. But the one thing that I'd say is creating a data inventory that's fit for purpose, one that goes into this level of depth and addresses, as Simon said, the third parties and retention is definitely going to put you in good stead as the foundations to your compliance efforts. Tilly, any war stories or comments you'd like to share here around establishing data inventories?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of working with clients, and going back to sort of this whole sort of pre-post GDPR, obviously there was a big push to get ROPAs into place. And a lot of organizations sort of have got a ROPA that can sort of be produced if requested sort of by a supervisory authority. But I think one of the largest challenges that I've seen in particular is for organizations, as we touched upon, to kind of keep the integrity of these documents up to date, and make sure that sort of the process around kind of feeding into the ROPA to making sure that the data in there is being updated, validated, sort of on a regular basis is really the challenge. And of course, it's one of these things that sort of, if you're relying on systems or your ROPA for sort of the inventory of where your data is, and also sort of applications and systems used, so your data life cycle, if it's not kept up to date, it's going to lead to challenges when you get data subject requests, or if there is an incident, because you basically have lost track of where the data is within the organization. So I think one of the main things is just to make sure sort of that all the key stakeholders are involved, that you're reviewing your ROPA and processes on a regular basis. And as sort of Tanya mentioned, sort of when we spoke before, one thing that's really key is to make sure sort of that you have the buy-in from the organization, because again, sort of just as mentioned before, it's not just going to be the responsibility of the IT department or the data protection department to make sure sort of that the ROPA or that the company's data retention policy sort of is being complied with. It's the whole organization. And there will be steps that sort of individuals need to take within different functions to either classify data, to report up sort of a new processing activity that they're looking to move forward with, or perhaps it's a new system that's being brought into play. So it's just really making sure that sort of all the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together, which will lead to sort of having your ROPA and also systems as up to date as possible, which will obviously sort of lead to a better sort of organization, and also help in the long term when getting requests from data subjects. But as mentioned before, if there is an audit from the supervisory authority or something along those lines, or touch words, a data breach, it will help you identify sort of where your data is, and also your problem points and what you need to sort of focus on. So yeah, I think that's my input on that.
I appreciate it, Tilly. Thank you. Tanya, any practical insights or advice you'd like to share with mapping data assets, excuse me, or around establishing a data inventory?
Yeah, so I totally agree with everything that Tilly said. And alongside that as well, one thing that I've found has been very, very useful is treating the sort of data governance, data inventory side of things the same as data privacy. So we go with a data privacy by design approach, which is what the ICO recommends you do. So we try and have things like data privacy and governance activities embedded in very early stages of all of our development and change process. And if you've got your data mapping activities embedded at that very early stage as well, it means that when new information is coming in, when new third parties are being used, when any kind of new transformations are being applied to the data that you already have, you can start documenting that in those early stages, and you can see how it's going to impact other processes and other activities and modify everything appropriately. And it makes it a lot easier to manage. But also, this is a laborious process. I know because I'm going through it myself at the moment. It is the kind of thing that you really need to make sure that you are investing in if you are a senior in your business. You need to be behind it as much as the people that are actually doing it, because if you're not behind it, then nobody further down the line is going to be, and the longer it'll take to get it done.
Yeah, I can speak to some of your observations there about being resource intensive. I was speaking to a DPO at a conference late last year, and she said that almost a year to the day, her and a colleague had spent the year traveling around to each office to interview key stakeholders to build this data map out. And then essentially, as soon as they put it together, a big Excel spreadsheet, it was kind of out of date. But the main thing was it didn't really connect to anything. It didn't integrate a lot of the data sources and a lot of the processes you see on the slide here that it needs to. And essentially, it wasn't used as a business asset. It was just kind of ticking that compliance box. So I can definitely speak to that, being resource intensive, and that's where sometimes technologies can help to help reduce that burden. Tanya, also we touched on it briefly in the doorstep dispensary case, but I'm interested to hear your comments around paper, hard copy documents, and kind of the difficulties you might face in incorporating it into the inventory, especially at volume.
We're very lucky in that regard, in that we don't have a lot of paper-based stuff these days. We were quite quick to adopt digital for basically everything. So even when we are sending out like paper mail and things like that, it's all digital first and paper second. And we don't tend to keep paper copies of things. And where we do, it's all read into our large data store, into our data lake. So we've always got evidence of it that we can log and track quite easily.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Tilly, Simon touched on this, but what about the company's suppliers? I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts on uncovering that network of third parties and vendors and the data challenges organizations often face in doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, again, this is an absolute sort of massive topic that kind of goes into the privacy program of an organization, and sort of a review, an ongoing review, and also review of sort of third-party vendors is sort of no exception. And so, I mean, I think when sort of, and as Tanya mentioned, kind of going through the data mapping process, it's important to sort of identify those third parties, but also it's important to understand sort of what data is being passed on to those third parties, and also sort of the terms around that. Like, I know that sounds a lot easier than it is, but sort of in terms of actually understanding what sort of your data processing agreements sort of contain, and if your relationship with those third parties changes in any way, shape, or form, that there needs to be some type of trigger that basically will lead to either the data map being updated and then sort of having the ROPA updated and things along those lines. But it's important to basically have an overview and a handle of third parties you're using, in what particular functions are using those third parties and what data fields, and have that documented and reviewed on a regular basis. Because going back to sort of, as we discussed, if you do receive a data subject request, or there is an incident either sort of on the processor side, and you get notification of it as the controller, you need to understand in terms of a data breach, you need to understand extremely quickly what data fields could have or have been compromised. So having that understanding and that overview of what third parties you are using and for what, and also the agreed sort of data retention periods tied to that data. If you are sort of using a third party to process any type of data, is really key, and sort of as required sort of by the GDPR as well, making sure that you are auditing your third parties that you are using to make sure that they are deleting data in accordance with sort of what's been agreed and in accordance with the data retention periods that's been agreed, and things along those lines. So that's really, really key. And we've seen sort of organizations build in that trigger in different ways. A lot of the times, sort of procurement teams are sort of tied into the process, because obviously sort of third parties sort of will require payment and things along those lines. So there's different ways of ensuring sort of, like I said, that trigger is activated if sort of arrangements do change, or new third parties are engaged, or contracts are or cease. But just making sure that you are reviewing that and have a good sort of oversight of what's going on. And one thing that we've seen, which helps sort of organizations, is to actually sort of go through an overview or sort of audit sort of on an annual basis, and just sort of pick out a sample of third parties and just make sure that you have access to the information that those third parties sort of are processing, and things along those lines. Because I will absolutely guarantee you that you will find areas of improvement, sort of having conducted a sort of audit that sort of the organization can focus on, sort of to improve things as well. So I think that sort of sums up my thoughts on that.
You know, interesting points you made, and for me, it kind of comes back to data. Data is just tying everything together, right? I mean, you mentioned DSARs, breach notifications, even e-discovery. All of those practices rely on data. So if you are able to know what data you have and know it really well, establish a data inventory, covering all the different aspects and different considerations we have here on this slide, then you're going to be well grounded to achieve any of your legal GRC objectives, not just with data retention or DSARs or any kind of siloed practices across the whole board. If you understand what data you have and all the aspects of your data, then you're already halfway there. So no, many thanks for that. And we had a question come up here, and Simon, I wanted to get your thoughts on it quickly before we move on. The question was, any tips on selling the rope order, the data map or data inventory as a business asset? How would you pitch this to the board?
Sorry, what was that question on selling the ROPA? Oh, selling it into the board. Sorry.
Yeah, the idea and concept. So, asking for investment into doing this.
No, it was really good to hear you guys talk about that, because I think that's such a it's such an important area for organisations, and those that have succeeded or done well in this area and developed their records of processing have been successful in terms of being able to to really sell it into the board and and key decision makers on how important. And I think that's the key point, is that so many different functions across the business are processing personal data, are collecting it, are using it in different ways. And so it is an organisational challenge, really, and I think that's why it's so important. It's not something that one team can do. And you have to understand that so many different functions will process the data. I think we mentioned about procurement as well, can be very central to this. But in terms of being able to sell it in, I think it is around the well, first of all, there's obviously the compliance side, that you do need this. This is a requirement for most organisations to have the record of processing, but particularly it helps you to gain control of your data. If you think of it as a control mechanism, it helps you to understand what it is that you have, what you're using it for, and what protection that you're giving to your customers, to your employees, etc. So I think if you think of it from that point of view, there's obviously ethical considerations around that you need to know. You need to be able to understand it and have the protections that are in place as well. So I think that's the kind of the way that I'd approach it with boards, but it is quite a difficult one, I think, but to actually pitch, because it's so broad and across the organisation. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear what what others think of that too.
Yeah, a couple of comments for me just before we move on. I'm just conscious of time. It's a difficult one. I think for smaller companies, startups where resources are limited, it's always going to be about just doing what you can with the resources you have. So I appreciate in those instances, it's very difficult to create data inventories and processes around privacy and compliance, data protection to this depth. That's completely understandable. For the larger organizations, you mentioned it there, Simon, this isn't a choice, you have to do it. And for me, the data inventory lends itself to so many different practices across the business, with privacy, compliance, IT, or the cybersecurity, e-discovery, even if you've got a DSAR team or your data managers in different areas doing things, all of those practices across the business rely on data. So if you can have those really strong and important conversations with those different stakeholders, bring together some kind of data champions or some sort of program where you can really try and centralize this and maybe even steal a little bit of everyone's budget into one pool to get this up, it's going to help everyone across the board, and it's going to help the organization. So it really is, for me, and one thing that I always argue is for me, it's the critical foundations to any kind of legal governance, risk, or compliance platform. If you don't know what data you have, you're going to find it very difficult to respond to breach notifications in the 72-hour timeframes, 30-day DSARs. I mean, if you were to put a press release out as an example, and you get a huge amount of DSAR requests, successfully fulfilling them in that 30-day timeframe is pretty difficult to achieve if you don't know what data you have. So no, many thanks for the question and for the comments on there, guys. This next section here is deciding on retention schedules, retention periods. And Simon, you're going to run us through these next few slides and provide some commentary on best practices and setting retention schedules.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll take you through this, some of this from the guidance that we've mentioned. The first place to start when you're trying to decide on your retention periods is to identify, for the various different kind of data sets that you have across the organization, looking, is there a legal or statutory kind of requirement around us retaining that data? So kind of looking looking at kind of the laws that must be in place around that. And appreciate these do vary depending on if you're in many different territories, or if you're just maybe UK focused or EU focused. That's going to make a difference for you as an organization. So let's look at things like employment data, for example. So the UK employment law says that you must retain data for the length of the employment plus 6 years. But again, in some different territories, that can vary. So you do need to be considering if that's if you can rely on one standard for your organisation, or if you've got to be looking at the different requirements in different territories. So you've got data, for example, like health and safety. Certain health and safety data has to be retained for the life of the group entity. Certain medical and occupational health records need to be held for 40 years. Again, financial reporting, UK law kind of requires financial reporting records to be held for 7 years from the financial year end. So there are many different things. I think it's important just to recognise that there isn't, for a start, a blanket period. It's going to vary on what data you have and the purposes that you're keeping it for. But I think the start point is to be thinking about, so is there a law that requires me to keep this data for a certain period? Then from there, it's thinking about, so do we then have a duty to preserve those documents for longer? To preserve them if they're involved in a kind of UK legal proceedings, or in fact legal proceedings in other parts of the world. So as soon as your organisation knows that it is, or it may become party to civil proceedings, it's under obligations then at that point, legal duties to in relation to those proceedings, which may well require retaining certain data. Got to identify again, is the data required to be able to manage those legal proceedings? And if it is, you may need to keep those for a certain period longer and keep track of how long the legal proceedings are going, so that you can identify then. You can't obviously keep them indefinitely. You still need to be able to track it at that point, so that when the legal proceedings end, you have to then take another review and identify whether it's appropriate to delete or to anonymize the data at the end of that period. So if you identify then that the data is, you don't need to keep it for a legal reason, then you're starting to think about, if I've not got a statutory period, then I need to be thinking about, so what data is necessary, and how long is necessary? How long is that period for me to keep the data? So I think this is also where kind of data minimization comes in, and it's recognizing that you've got to think about this kind of holistically around a data set that you hold. You might need to retain certain types of data for specific periods, but you don't necessarily need to keep the whole data set. For example, if take marketing records, for example, you might need to keep certain information on the customer, but you don't necessarily need to keep all of their behavioural information, or potentially past purchase information going back years and years. So thinking about which data you actually need to hold, and again, according to minimisation, you want to be removing some of that data or deleting some of that data sooner than other data that you do need to retain for longer. And then it's about thinking about the kind of outsourcing, and thinking, as we just mentioned, I think on the previous slide, is about where you're outsourcing to processors. Is being able to identify, so who is it that that is holding our data outside of the organisation, and to be able to think about that and understand how long they're holding the data, and recognise that if you're the controller, you need to be briefing those organisations. You need to be providing clear contractual instructions for the retention of that data. It's not for them to make their minds up how long they should keep the data. It's for the controller to brief the processors on what the requirements are. Thanks, Stuart. Do you want me to carry on from here, or?
Yes, please. We've got decisions to be made now.
Great. Okay, I'll move on from here. So in terms of the decisions that you've made, so you've gone through the stuff that we've just covered. Then you need to decide, when you've identified the period that you need to hold the data, which data you're holding, but you're going to retain. You need to think about, so what course of action shall we take at the end of the retention period? So the obvious one, I think, for many organisations is to delete that data. That's the obvious kind of first course of action that organisations would look at. But also be clear what you're going to do with your backups. Quite often backups are held for a certain period afterwards, and there's an automated process around backups. But you do need to think about that. You can't ignore data that are held on backups. So deletion, I think, is the most common way to remove personal data. The second one that we often kind of get queries on is pseudonymized data. So just to explain and make sure that we're all on the same page with what pseudonymization is. So that's the process that substitutes kind of any personal information in a data set that identifies individuals. It substitutes that information with an artificial identifier, or pseudonym as it's called. So something like, for example, maybe a unique reference number or a hash key or something. But the key point, I think, involved with pseudonymization is the fact that anyone then accessing that data would need additional information to re-identify the individual. So it is still possible for the organisation to re-identify that individual. So consequently, pseudonymizing records at the end, when you no longer need them, yes, it can reduce the privacy risk. It does kind of protect it in the situation of a breach or something like that. But it doesn't actually remove your obligations under GDPR, or it doesn't actually remove your obligation in terms of getting rid of data when you no longer need it. It just means that you're reducing the risk. So our advice on that one is to actually consider the other options. Pseudonymization is really about risk minimization. It's not really about what you do at the end of the period. You should be looking to delete or anonymize or destroy records. So we look at anonymization. There are reasons why organizations might want to anonymize data instead, i.e. completely take out any personal information that relates to it. So that can be required. So some systems, for example, don't have the capability for you to completely delete the record. It damages the integrity of them. So be aware that some systems do have that, do have those kind of constraints. But in addition, you might want to report some kind of key performance indicators. So you need to know how many records existed, for example, on if you're looking at a data set that you're looking to, has reached its retention period. You've held it, say, for example, financial data that you've held for 7 years. You might need to know how many records there were at the time. So you might then therefore need to anonymize it so that you can keep your KPIs and your reporting intact and keep the integrity of that. So anonymization is another popular option. And obviously we can't forget the physical records, so paper-based records. I don't think many organisations have got microfiches and things like that, but obviously if you're holding personal records in any other forms, any other physical forms, you need to be considering that too, and looking around shredding and incineration and things like that as well. So I think after that, once you have identified, so what are we going to do at the end of the period, you can then go about communicating to the internal stakeholders what the decision is on how long you're keeping it and what method you're going to use at the end of the retention period. And the best way to do that, we find, is to, first of all, obviously to update your data retention policy. You should have a policy that makes it clear what you're going to do at the end of the period, but the schedule is the important thing, because the schedule, the data retention schedule, should identify the different assets that you have, the different data sets that you're holding, the location of those, the retention period, and what action you're taking at the end of the period. And obviously it's really important to make sure that you're communicating those to the teams, because at the end of the day, they're going to have data owners that are responsible for the data, they're actively processing the data, and they need to know what the rules are around when you reach the end of the period.
Thanks, Simon. You touched on a few of these already, but if you wouldn't mind, just at a high level, a few comments on best practices as data reaches its retention period.
Which bit was it you were thinking, Stuart? I think of which bit did I not cover?
So just the new slide that's popped up now. So as data reaches, yes, the ongoing process.
Sorry, you just switched slides. Sorry, I took my glasses off. Yeah. So as data kind of reaches the ongoing period, reaches the retention period, you need an ongoing process. So what we've been talking about here really is the setup process, how you go about making decisions around the data and how you go about briefing the business. What you then need to do is kind of productionize it and have a kind of ongoing routine whereby you can identify the data that, let's take monthly, for example, that in that month has reached its retention period, to be able to identify, well, these are the records. So it might be, for example, employee records that have reached the period, people that have left the organization a long time ago. It might include marketing records, could include suppliers, all sorts of different things. So at that point, you've identified the records that have reached the period. You'd want to be able to notify the business owner that is responsible for that data, to be able to flag it up that it's reached the period. Consider any changes. So again, we mentioned about legal hold. You might have certain requirements that it needs to be retained for longer, and again, the business owners will be in a position to be able to notify you of that, to make sure that you're holding that data. If there's no change, you can go ahead and just take the course of action that you've agreed, which, as I say, in most cases will be to delete the data, but in some cases might be to anonymize it. So this is really the check step, making sure that you productionize it and you check with the business first before you go ahead and delete it or anonymize it. You'd also want to keep some kind of evidence that you've done it. What records do you have? Obviously, you can't keep the records themselves. You don't want to be doing that. You're obviously destroying those, but you need some evidence that you've gone ahead and done the deletion or destruction or anonymization of that record. And then you go on to the next batch. So this is really an ongoing process that you would do for for each batch of records that reaches its retention period. That all kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Simon, and much appreciated. And some important comments made there that follow on from DPN's data retention guidance. So if you haven't already, I do encourage you to download the guidance from the DPN website. Yeah, many thanks, Simon.
So I just add one more thing, Stuart, that sure. I didn't really mention, is that I talked about the data retention schedule. And for many organisations, that will link in very much to your record of processing. In fact, it might be your record of processing, because obviously you need to note your assets, your assets and how they process your data assets and how they're processed, and your retention period, of course, on the ROPA. So it may be one and the same document, or it may be a separate document that has to integrate with your records. So it's not to, again, it just shows the importance of having everything a totally joined up approach.
Yeah, totally agree. And thanks again, Simon, for the comments and walking us through those slides. So as Simon's probably touched on, and as you've probably alluded to already, there are various and significant challenges with implementing retention periods. And I think this slide summarizes the main ones pretty well. Tilly, let's bring you in here. I'm interested to hear your thoughts and perhaps any experiences you might like to share on the challenges faced when implementing the data retention.
Yeah, so I mean, we've touched upon it before, but I think one of the main challenges that sort of organizations have faced and still face is sort of dealing with that sort of age-old sort of legacy data. And I think a lot of obviously with GDPR sort of coming in, and we're coming on to, or past actually the second year sort of anniversary, it's still an issue that organizations are still dealing with, sort of presently with current data, but obviously that legacy aspect as well. And I think there's one thing that's kind of really important. I know it sounds a bit obvious, is there's not sort of one silver bullet solution for all of this. And it's sort of, as mentioned before, it is a long, drawn out process that constantly needs to be evaluated, reviewed, and also sort of new and old stakeholders and parties within your organization and functions being brought in to sort of put their input into kind of what data they're needing for their organizations or their function within the organizations to sort of do their job. And also that ties in with the strategy of the organization, right? I mean, I hate to sort of bring it up, but obviously we're going through sort of the COVID-19 period at the moment, and a lot of organizations are having to sort of change strategies and operations sort of based on sort of the situation we all find ourselves in. So I think going back to sort of what's sort of applied on other slides to this, it really is the basis and starting point is understanding and sort of classifying what data you have and what systems you are using, and how that data sort of is collected. So its whole life, I keep on saying the data life cycle, but it's so important to know what data is being collected, for what purpose it's being collected, sort of, and review that process, how it's filtering through sort of the systems that your organization's using, and how it's being classified and stored within sort of the software your organization uses. And then also sort of bringing in, I would imagine in most organizations, it would sort of be the IT team at the sort of the end of that. Well, to be honest, they need to be brought in all the way through and have their buy-in, but sort of at the end of it, sort of flagging or implementing either notifications or, so to speak, pressing the big sort of green button to delete that data in accordance with how it's been classified. And then sort of, as mentioned, as either functions or corporate strategy changes, or if everything sort of, to be honest, stays the same, it still needs this constant reviewing and updating sort of step within there. And I think we touched upon sort of getting the senior leadership sort of buy-in with all of this. And I think once sort of the senior leadership team really understands that sort of the data retention can basically sort of, you know, be equated to basically sort of the health of the data almost, and obviously is a legal requirement with GDPR, but as mentioned before, we have a number of pieces of legislations coming into play. Obviously CCPA came into force the 1st of January, and July it's actually going to be sort of enforceable in California, and Brazil's coming out with an act. So we're seeing a lot of other jurisdictions bringing in GDPR sort of styled data protection act. So I think the more we build this into our sort of day-to-day processes and build it into the corporate culture, the easier it's going to be, and sort of the more it will become sort of a daily or expected sort of part of the process. And I think so. What I'm trying to say is, sort of going forward, I hope it's not going to be as onerous as it has been, but I think we're still working through. And I am working with a number of clients, still kind of working through that legacy data, which is sort of still causing a number of sort of issues and sort of holding sort of the process back, in terms of there's a lot of organizations have just kept everything for so long, which has now created the process. But I think drawing a line in the sand and putting processes in place sort of, you know, from now going forward, so your future and current data is sort of classified and flagged, and that process is there, then that enables you to kind of go back to the legacy data and really take a look at what you've kept or keeping, and really ask sort of the hard questions. Do you need that data based upon, and are you using that data based upon sort of where the corporate strategy is going? So I mean, I think I didn't really say anything new there, but I think it's just really important to stress that sort of the whole data life cycle really needs to be sort of understood to be able to really operationalize the retention periods. And sort of as was mentioned, as Simon mentioned, with the data retention sort of policy and schedules, again, it's important to make sure that you've got that document in place and that you are deleting data in accordance with that, because that really does put you in that defensible position. Because if you have that data retention policy schedule and you're not deleting data in accordance with that, that is going to open up a large risk for your organization. Or if you don't have that data retention policy schedule in place, you know, regulators are going to ask why not, and just sort of at the moment, you know, sort of saying, you know, you need to put yourself in a defensible position, and having that policy in place is really sort of key to your defensible position, and making sure that you are building out, if you don't have already, the processes to operationalize those requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Tilly. Some important points you made there, and one thing I picked up on was with legacy data. I mean, this is a problem, and the amount of data that's created, it's never going to slow down, right? Data's the volume of data being created is snowballing. So the longer you leave this, and the more difficult essentially the challenges. Tanya, it'd be great to get your insights and comments here around the challenges in operationalizing data retention.
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest challenges that I can think of that hasn't already been covered is that, especially as part of a large multinational corporation, different parts of a business will need the same data but for different reasons, and as a result will need to hold it for different lengths of time. If you don't communicate effectively with all of the business areas that are using that particular data item, when you put your retention schedule into place, it's going to cause problems, and you're probably going to end up with some sort of disagreement on your hands as well, which nobody wants, do they? But yeah, so you need to always make sure that you're engaging everybody as you're going through the process of putting together your retention schedule, and any reviews of it going forwards, everybody needs to be involved again, because you need to make sure that what you're doing is not only compliant, but also allows people to do their jobs appropriately and properly, and allows you to, if you are in a customer serving industry, serve your customers appropriately as well.
Yeah, it's a great point there, Tanya, actually, regarding kind of collaboration and being involved with stakeholders. And I guess one of the examples that springs to my mind is with legal holds and data retention, or even DSARs. I think Simon touched on this earlier, where if you go ahead and are able to fulfill that really complex and tricky DSAR within the time frame, and you almost end up patting yourself on the back, but then you find out it was on a legal hold, and you've already gone ahead and deleted the data, you've got a bigger problem than what you started with. So it's very much about making sure that the data you have is visible across the different practices and kind of works in concert and works in harmony with different practices. Data shouldn't be treated in silos, and to your point, it's used for different things across the organization. So unless different departments and stakeholders have visibility or some kind of control or access to that data, you're going to just create inefficiencies and problems. So no, many thanks for your comments there, guys, on the challenges. So just to quickly run through this slide, as you probably, I'm sure you've alluded to, managing data retention and taking defensible actions on deleting data can be very challenging indeed. I would argue that using technology to assist in operationalizing that data retention has become almost a necessity in some cases, especially with larger companies and organizations working across different countries and jurisdictions. Mapping the retention schedules to all your data types in your inventory and understanding which standards apply to the data can be very confusing, and to Tanya's earlier point, can be very resource intensive. So leveraging a directory of industry standards can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, especially if you do operate across those different countries. The graphic on the slide here with all the retention standards for different countries should illustrate this complexity. As business context changes as well, retention schedules change, which again is very challenging to keep up with and to manage. Data is extremely mobile. Your retention schedules you set last year might not now apply and subsequently create risk. Great example is with employee data. So as a current employee, my records have one set of retention standards. If I become an ex-employee, it's a different set. There needs to be some manual tasks and manual tasks done to change the retention periods of that data. A machine can't do this for you. And you need to be able to explain why you have data or why you don't, in some cases, for audits and reviews. And technology could take a lot of this manual processes off your plate, free up the time and reduce the human error involved. And establishing deletion strategies that documents the logic and creates an audit trail for review actions is also very important, especially when it comes to demonstrating defensibility, which Tilly touched on. And again, your company data is always changing. Your data inventory and retention practices need to be actively managed, reviewed, and refined. This isn't a set it and forget it one-off project, it's a business process. So this final slide here before Q&A, I know we're a little bit over time here, we've got about 5 minutes left. We have a 3-step develop, implement, and maintain process for data minimization. Should summarize the content we've run through today. So just at a really high level, I'll ask each of our speakers to provide any key takeaways. Simon, anything in particular from this slide you'd like to comment on, or final words for our audience?
Yeah, thanks. I think we have covered an awful lot of ground today. So probably a couple of things that I'd probably kind of leave you with is the fact that, like many people, organisations quite often do hoard that data. People hang on to it naturally for too long. And I think just one thing I want to say is it's okay to challenge people on that. To say, do you really need to keep that data? Why is it that you feel that you need to keep it? And how long is actually necessary. I've come across many situations whereby you drill down a bit and you find that either people recognise, no, we don't actually need to hold it, or we may have held it too long already, or maybe we do need some of it, but not all of it. But so that's the first thing. It's okay to challenge people on this and do it obviously in a nice, supportive way. but you might have to ask some tough questions. And the other bit kind of around it is just there is a lot to it. I know we've covered quite a lot of ground. It isn't the easiest of areas, but just make a start is what I'd say. Get started on it. Journey starts with a few steps. So even if it's not perfect, even if you don't make it, everything work from the start, you can start moving along the journey and start to understand, what data you're holding in different places, and start to engage with the business to be able to identify and review the data retention periods and help your organisation to manage the process. And hopefully giving you some useful tips to do it today.
No, thanks, Simon. Appreciate it. And Tilly, a few quick words from you and key takeaways.
Yeah, I'd say sort of a key takeaway is definitely sort of on the cultural side of the organization. I think it's really important sort of to have sort of allies. If you're sitting in the data protection department or whatever department you're in, but this is sort of your focus or your responsibility for, it's really important to sort of have those allies and key functions to help to either flag or to help you understand sort of what the function's doing and what data sort of is being collected and how it's being processed. Because you can't, one person or one sort of team of people can't know everything about the organization. So it's really important to keep communication open and train people so they fully understand why sort of this whole journey is important. So I really sort of stress the culture side and just educating and communicating with everyone within the organization why this is important and what this means sort of to move the organization forward. So yeah.
Thanks, Tilly, appreciate it. And Tanya, I'll leave the final words to you. Any key takeaways or advice you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. I want to reiterate what Tilly said. The sort of cultural community aspect of it is really, really important. If you've not got the right culture, it's not going to stick. But it's about how you go about creating that culture. You need to think about your audience when you're trying to get the message across. It's not going to be the same message for every group of people. You want to make sure that what you're saying resonates with them, whether that be because it shows why it's important for their role or because you're making them understand that this is what could happen to their information if companies that they've given their information to isn't being minimized properly. And reiterating my earlier point as well, you've got to go for data retention and data minimization by design. Get it in at the early stages because it makes it so much easier to deal with later down the line.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. We are on the hour now, so please stay with us if you can for a few extra minutes of your day, and we'll try and cover a few questions coming. We're not going to be able to get through them all. Simon, let me ask you the first question, and we'll have to keep the answers a little bit concise here due to timings. There was a question that came in: any advice RE email accounts and how best to review accounts of ex-employees? Any comments there from you?
Yeah, that is naturally quite a tricky one to do because you need to be able to identify, other than the fact that you've got the recipient and the sender's emails, but the emails themselves might, of course, contain personal data on customers or other individuals. So, you know, in terms of unstructured data as well that can be present within the emails. So I think tools can help you with this. There are tools out there that can be used to search through emails to be able to identify where personal data is. And I'd be looking to the tools, and obviously for the support of the individuals, the line managers, and people that people that can help you in the organisation to be able to identify those. But it can be quite a challenge. But equally, the other thing that's important is having a standard archiving and deletion rules across the business. This is where policies come in, and making sure that people are aware of what the requirements are. So if somebody's left the business, in theory, they should have cleansed their emails. But at that point happen, it can easily not happen. So the tools can actually help you to be able to track through that.
Thanks, Simon. One here, Tanya, picking up on one of your points from earlier. So it says, Tanya mentioned that data is mainly digital. Do you think there is a good reason for organisations to hold any or many paper records these days? And I imagine sometimes you have to, but any thoughts on going digital transformation?
Oh, that's a really good one. I mean, personally, I think having everything digital makes things a lot easier when you're looking at things like subject access requests and data deletion, purely because you know where everything is and you know how to get rid of it or how to extract it and pass it on to the individual. But at the same time, there's always a risk when it comes to anything in cyberspace, and it only takes one person doing something that they shouldn't do, either by accident or on purpose, for a data breach to occur. So I think it's a case-by-case kind of thing. If you're in an environment where it is better to have that information on paper and you can log it, track it, and deal with it in a compliant way, then go for it. But if it's better for you to be keeping it digitally because of the volume or because of the nature of it, then digital.
Thanks, Tanya. Makes sense. One for you, Tilly, and I think we touched on this in the previous conversations, but question asked, how can you evidence that you have deleted or destroyed data? Any quick comments on that one?
Yeah, so I think this is quite a complex question, but I think in summary, what needs to be, and we always recommend as well that sort of a data subject request log is basically kept, and obviously sort of regarding individuals' names and things along those lines, code should be sort of used, but basically keeping a record of the fact that sort of a request has come in and it's been complied with, and going back to this whole thing about, I mean, normally confirmation of a deletion request is communicated via an email as such. So sort of you won't be providing any type of documents, obviously, by the type of the nature of request it is. But I think having sort of going into what we've discussed in this session, having overview over sort of what data and also the systems this the data subject's data would have flowed through, really does provide the basis for the deletion request to be fulfilled, and to make sure that you are deleting all the data that you do hold. And actually on sort of that point, as Tanya just mentioned regarding paper forms, if sort of paper forms are being used, it does make sort of the review and the identification of a data subject's data that much harder to track, and also then to ensure it's been deleted rather than sort of the IT departments sort of deleting the data sort of as requested. So it's you know, confirmations generally communicated to a data subject via email that it's been deleted, but I think just having sort of going back to what we discussed all the way through, just having that overview and ensuring you know all the systems that have been the data's flowed through is really crucial to be able to fulfill those deletion requests, and also access requests and all the other sort of data subject right requests that the GDPR or other legislation permits data subject to request.
Thanks, Steve, much appreciated. The final one here is where do I find details about what applies in a retention period to an information item? Example, how long can I keep a technical support interaction in a ticket system, or best practices? Just really to cover this one off, Simon, is this available or a lot of different examples available in the DPN data retention guidance document?
Yeah, there are actually. So the way the guidance is structured, it's got kind of a lot of the things that we kind of took you through, the decision-making process first, but at the end of that, apart from giving some real life examples around a commercial business and a not-for-profit, etc., we've got some real examples. But then there's a range of templates for the different types of processing that you have, which, you know, financial data, marketing data, etc., medical data. There's a template for probably, I think there's around about 15 templates or so at the end. I'm not sure if that specific query is in there, but definitely have a look. We consulted with a wide range of people to be able to pull this information together. I should point out that where it's based on a law, we've used UK law on that. We couldn't go through all of the laws that apply across the world, so you need to look at that if you're dealing with data outside the UK. And also, obviously, we can't cover every single type of data, but you will find a lot of reference information and kind of typical periods. I won't say that they're necessarily the necessary periods for every business, because we won't know all about your different processing. But in form of it being guidance, there's a lot of tables in there to help you.
That's great. Thank you to everyone for all the questions, and our apologies for not being able to get through more on air today. We've already stolen 8 minutes of your time, so many thanks for staying with us. I'd like to say a big thank you to our speakers, Simon Blanchard, partner at Data Protection Network Associates, Tilly Lang, data protection practitioner, and Tanya Joyce, data solutions manager at British Gas Business. Pleasure to have you all on the panel today, and thank you indeed for sharing your time with us today. Much appreciated. And for more information on anything we've covered in today's webinar, do please get in touch or visit Extero's website, where you can learn more about Extero's legal GRC software solutions and how they can help address your data inventory and data retention challenges we've run through today. Thank you again for everyone for tuning in. Please stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.